I think there is a certain mystery around this concerto.
Of course it is very challenging. It is difficult technically, it is difficult musically. There are many layers in this concerto. I think that this concerto almost transcends the boundaries of expression, of musical expression, and of Rachmaninoff's inner world as well.
This concerto is often misinterpreted as this showman piece, as this war horse, as this very, very grandiose piece which is designed to impress. It is not designed to impress. To me, it is a very tortured and very uneven path from darkness into light. It is a piece of nearly symphonic dimensions, a symphony for piano and orchestra, written in such a strange conglomerate of styles, which ranges from the early classical to the late romantic expressionist, and even almost going into the 20th century. That it is very hard to do this music justice, to do this music full justice. My main issue is to make it sound like a symphonic work, a symphonic dialogue between the piano and the orchestra. I do not want it to sound like an accompaniment, because if played like an accompaniment, it often sounds like trashy music. And I think it is great music, but it's music which requires a huge input from all sides. And in fact, it is much more difficult to perform such a concerto well, also for an orchestra, than to perform, for instance, a tone poem by Strauss. Because in tone poem by Strauss, or sometimes even in the Mahler symphony, you're well protected, you're well pampered by the composer. With Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto, you're completely naked. You've got what you've got. You've got to work for it. It is very difficult. It is a huge marathon piece for a pianist, for everyone. But if you approach it as a piece of music, first of all, and then as this mount of technical difficulties, I think there are always ways. I mean, if you listen to the old recordings with Horowitz or whoever they were, it wasn't always that perfect. If you hear Rachmaninoff playing his piece, There is not a single thing, not a single passage he does for effect. Everything becomes part of his very unique expressive world. No sentimentality, no flashing about, no impressing people with the passage work, although technically he was probably the most advanced pianist of his time. And to me, his playing still remains unsuperseded by anyone in terms of the range of colors and the range of expression. But there is no sentimentality.
He was performing from a point of view of a composer, not from a point of view of a soloist. So he was very balanced in his performances. He thought in a very symphonic way about his piano and interaction with the orchestra as well. So although his tempi are very fast, one can still hear all the nuances and all the very delicate things among all those, among all the many notes that are in the concerto. It was premiered in the United States in 1909 in New York, and this was part of a long tour for him. And so, in a way, in my opinion, this was Rachmaninoff sending a statement or a message about his environment back home in Russia to the Western world. That, of course, is a very rich world which is influenced by Russian church, by the nature, by culture in general.
It was also a piece which is largely based upon the traditional religious canonic melodies from the Russian Orthodox Church. When I was growing up, when I was a teenager, it was still not unproblematic to go into the church, even if you wanted to listen to Rachmaninoff's Vesper Mass. It could have cost you some social problems, and I think we found it extremely appealing to be looking for those things in the otherwise really mundane world of classical music, because we were deprived of Bach's Passions, we were deprived of all of the pieces which had the religious connotation. So at least we were allowed to look for religious connotations or spiritual connotations in pieces like Rachmaninoff piano concertos. But believe me, they are there. I'm not inventing them, I'm not reading them into it. They are there.
Definitely. The beginning, for example, of the first movement, I think was influenced by some of the chants from the Russian church. Although Rachmaninoff himself, when he was asked this question, he said that no, the melody composed itself. It was not influenced by any chants directly, although I think indirectly perhaps it was, I think this beginning, which is a very sad, very lonely melody in the piano, accompanied by a very tender orchestral playing, and I think, yes, one can definitely see the parallels between those very caressed melodies and, for example, his Vespers, which was, and other liturgical music. There are two versions of the cadenza. One is the smaller one and one the ossia, the bigger one. And Rachmaninoff preferred the bigger cadenza, although many pianists played the smaller one, including Vladimir Jurowski, who, eventually made the concerto famous in 1920. cadenza is a huge build-up of great inner struggle, and I think it is in the end a very big explosion and in almost judgment day for all the darker sides of the world that Rachmaninoff painted in this concerto. In the second part of the cadenza, we hear the resolution, and we hear the almost heavenly harmonies of peace, love, and well, almost unearthly kindness, and it goes very high into the clouds. The beginning of the second movement, I think, is very interesting, very special, because after the overpowering drama of the first movement and the climax and the struggle between those two forces, the very dramatic minor and the very desperate and full of sorrow and sadness part, and with the very glorious and triumphal major, we come to the second movement, which starts with a very heartfelt and very highly spirited theme played by the orchestra. And in my view, this beginning of the second movement represents that idea of hope being caressed very, very carefully and with great admiration and almost a fear of losing it. Perhaps it's an impression of him coming out in his Ivanovka estate, where he composed into the fresh air and looking at the beautiful fields that he loved. I very much like the middle section of the third movement, which I find has a lot of humor, especially in the beginning of this middle section. It plays with rhythm a little bit. It plays with the orchestra. There's a dialogue with certain sections of the orchestra, and it is also a very kind section with a very heartfelt expression. The third movement ends in the most triumphal and the most it's beyond the clouds. It's the the glory of the victory, of the goodness, and I think it is so energizing and it's so fulfilling. It is so full of electricity and grace still, which should not be forgotten. That it really makes one's blood boil, I must say. It is very easy to lose the piano among the might of the of the big orchestra, and even in the lead up to the culmination, it's very easy for the orchestra to get taken by the moment and just to go ahead with the harmonies and the flow. Although if it is not done together with the pianist, and after all the soloist should be the leading impulse, and if it is structured in such a good way and it's balanced in such a way, then it creates an enormously a much bigger impression and a very a much more convincing one as well. And so yes, that's the very lucky thing to be playing this concerto with such great orchestras, because they have that knowledge and that very sensitive and considerate attitude.
Because we approach it as this mythical, fearful piece which everybody is afraid of, we often forget that it's not all about technical difficulties. And it's not sport. It's not a sportive competition. It's not about the perfection. It's about something else. And unfortunately, we are forgetting in our world of utter technical perfection and sterility that music was never meant to be perfect. It's always the striving for perfection, striving for harmony. But the further you move on, the further away gets the horizon.